Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Mr Speaker, it's a great delight for me to join in what I assume will be unanimous support for this bill being referred to the Health Select Committee. You can often learn a lot about a person's view of the world and the way they see their role in it by the contribution that they make in the House, and I just want to refer to the member who's just resumed his seat. I've enjoyed working with Dr Paul Hutchison on the Select Committee. He and I have very little in common in terms of policy, but mostly we have an interesting time on the Select Committee, and I've certainly enjoyed the last couple of years and will enjoy the next 12 months in that position. But what I found really interesting about the speech that Dr Paul Hutchison just made was that he said that this piece of legislation was a cause for celebration because it had been introduced by a national government in coalition with the Māori Party, and frankly, I don't think it gives a toss, actually. The point of this Parliament should be what legislation is being introduced, what is the policy behind it, what is the aim of it, who supports it in the end is really a strictly political issue. And I'm gobsmacked, actually, that a person who's had a medical background should think so little of the health consequences of the legislation we're discussing, but instead say, look at me, it's all about me and my party. Well, Dr Paul, it's not. It's not all about you and the National Party or the Māori Party. We should be celebrating this because finally this government has come to its senses on issues of improving people's health and the contribution that this Parliament can make to it. Mr Speaker, I want to commend the Honourable Tariana Turia. She's got a lot of steel in her, a lot of passion. I've seen it demonstrated on a number of occasions, sometimes on issues on which I was on the same side of her and sometimes on issues in which we disagree. But on this, Tariana Turia and actually Hone Harawira have been incredibly staunch and passionate and driven a change in thinking, particularly amongst people who needed that sort of role model and leadership to be demonstrated so they would change their view on using tobacco. And I want to say to the Honourable Tariana Turia that the introduction of this legislation is a huge credit to her and her persistence. I frankly don't know how she managed to persuade the members of the government who have voted consistently against similar moves, despite tonight crowing against it. Not every single member, 2 members of the National Party, 2 only out of the whole lot in 9 long years of a Labour-led government, 2 single members of the National Party supported moving towards more smoke-free environments. But Tariana Turia seems to have achieved that, and I want to commend her work in that. I also want to commend the work of the Māori Affairs Select Committee. They've had a fair bit on over the last little while, and they've done amazing work on the tobacco industry. I met one of the submitters recently on a visit to Timaru, where I've been working with some of the alcohol watch groups who also work alongside the tobacco restriction groups, the health promotion teams in Timaru. And one of the submitters from there was the woman who came along with the children and bought the coffin that represented what had happened to a member of their family and how they had watched him die early and in pain as a result of smoking. And that was not a stunt, actually, from that family. It was a heartfelt and heart-wrenching submission, which I think drew the eyes of the country towards an issue that we should be taking a much firmer stand on. I also want to commend my colleague Ian Lees-Galloway. Ian is the Member of Parliament for Palmerston North, and that's probably enough said about that. But he has actually made a fine contribution not only on the Health Select Committee but also, as he briefly acknowledged, in his own contribution on this bill in terms of the preparation and successful lodging of a members' bill which does much of what is in this bill. For a first-term opposition member of Parliament to have their members' bill adopted by the government and then celebrated by the chair of the Health Select Committee is certainly an achievement, and I want to commend Ian Lees-Galloway for that success. I think it's a very good initiative. Mr Speaker, I joined with other members of the House with our expression of surprise at the Minister who introduced the bill. I have nothing against the Honourable Nathan Guy at all, so this is not a comment which is meant to be of any insult to him in any way, but he's not a health minister. He was sitting just 2 seats away from the Minister of Health, who didn't make a contribution at all, let alone introduce the bill. And I was quite puzzled by that. I would have thought that when you had an Associate Minister of Health who was unable to take the call to introduce her own bill, that either another Associate Health Minister or the Health Minister himself would take the call and introduce this bill. I imagine that he might have been proud of it. He didn't say a word. Nathan Guy introduced the bill, and I had to ask my colleagues what Nathan Guy was the Minister of, because I could not understand his relationship to the health portfolio. But it has been explained to me. He's the Minister outside Cabinet, but he's the Minister of Internal Affairs, and as such he's responsible for the Fire Services Commission, and there the relationship between that minister and smoke ends, actually. There is no other relationship at all between that minister and this piece of legislation. I frankly think it's offensive to the Parliament, and particularly offensive to the Honourable Tariana Turia to have this bill treated in that regard. It's actually bad enough that it's being put through at 10 o'clock on a Friday night, when most 10:30, time flies when you're having such a good time, when most of us may well have preferred to be at home with our families rather than doing non-urgent legislation under urgency, so that we can knock off in time for the press gallery party early on an ordinary sitting week next week. It doesn't actually make much sense to me. Mr Speaker, over the last few years we've seen a large number of steps which progress what was outlined as the vision for New Zealand by the Māori Affairs Select Committee report, and that was a smoke-free New Zealand. We've seen our workplaces become smoke-free. We've seen our bars and our restaurants become smoke-free. We have seen successive increases in excise tax. We know that an increase in the price of cigarettes lowers the number of people who buy the packets of cigarettes. We've seen more investment in support for people to quit smoking, and I think the most recent initiative, other than the most recent tax increase, was the particularly gory photos that you'll see on cigarette packets. All of those moves have been evidence-based initiatives supported by the majority, but tragically by very few members of the National Party, all good progressive steps towards improving the health outcomes of New Zealanders. Because we know, Mr Speaker, that between 4,500 and 5,000 New Zealanders every year die not just prematurely, years before they would have had they not been smokers, but also a large number of them die in pain. And that's not something we'd wish on anyone. I recall in the earlier debate about excise duty saying that if tobacco was introduced now as a product for sale in our shops, given what we have learnt about it over the last few decades, we wouldn't allow it. We wouldn't allow it to be introduced as a product for sale. But trying to unscramble that egg is quite a difficult task. If somebody came to this Parliament and said, we've got a breakfast cereal, and if you just eat it in moderation every day, you know, a little bowl full of cereal, half of every single person who eats that cereal will die early and in pain as a direct result of using it as you're meant to, just